These are the proceedings for the 2014 meeting, ICAP, which have been published by the Synthase Library. The 2015 proceedings are on their way to publication. They have been kindly edited by Tom Powers, our host last year, and they will be soon ready for consultation. This is a kind of a longish premise to say, please do send your papers to Marcello and Matteo, because we're going to have the 2016 proceedings published by Field Studies. Do so, I think the deadline is September. I will stress it. I'm going to stress it, I'm going to say, being accepted at ICAP is a necessary but not sufficient condition to have your paper in the volume. There's going to be another round of reviews, and as you know by now, papers are going to be rejected. So the fact that you were here doesn't mean that you're going to be necessarily into the volume. Take it as another extra piece of nastiness that comes from me. But please do send me papers. It's important for us to build this kind of record of the papers we have had over the years, and it's important to consolidate this tradition. Okay, having done with the housekeeping, I'll go and introduce our keynote speaker today. So our keynote is Jack Copeland, and I have to say the editorial board, the executive board and myself, we are very much delighted to have him here. We started thinking about this more than a year ago, and we're really glad to see that this thing finally got finalized. So if you ever were interested in Turing, and you have come across books like The Essential Turing, Colossus, The Secrets of Bletchley Park's Code-Breaking Computers, Alan Turing's Electric Brain, or Computability, Turing, Gödel's Church, and beyond, then you have come across as well to Jack Copeland, who has authored all these books. So Jack is currently in New Zealand, where he is Distinguished Professor in Arts at the University of Canterbury, and he's also Director of the Turing Archive for the History of Computing, and Honorary Research Professor of Philosophy at the University of Queensland. Before going to New Zealand, Jack had a DPhil from the University of Oxford, and so I'm glad to share this stage with you today, even for that reason, or one reason more. Jack is here also because he will be delivering two keynotes, if you wish. So one is the Minds and Machine Lectures, which is a new tradition we're going to start. So there will be a Minds and Machine Lecture every year, supported and sponsored by the journal, and with a paper then to be published in the journal. But he's also the Covey Award receiver. So those of you who have attended some other ICAPs in the past know that we present two awards every year, the Covey and the Simon Award. And the Covey Award is presented to senior scholars who have contributed substantial innovation to the field of philosophy and computing, broadly conceived as a field. So past receivers have been Bill Rappaport, Salma Bridges was here, and Luciano was here yesterday, and Margaret Bowden. And this year we are very much delighted to present you with your award. If you'd like to join me, it took me a few days to have it designed the way I wanted, so I really am keen to present you with your award. Thank you very much. Okay, so as much as I like being on the stage, I'll leave it to Jack now.
Okay, thanks. Well, thank you very much, Rosaria, for that introduction, and thank you for the award as well. It's terrific to receive an award for doing something that you love. What could be better? I'm not convinced the microphone is working. Does it appear to be working to people in the back of the room? I also have a terrible habit of not talking into the microphone. I let it kind of slide sideways so people can't hear me. So if you see the microphone sliding, please shout out and correct my behavior. How are we doing? Can anyone not hear? All right, lots of nods. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to this lecture. I hope you're going to enjoy it. So my topic is the stored program story. And I'm going to go right back to the beginning of the modern era of computing, the stored program era. You might imagine that in those early days of stored programming, there was a terrible amount of very dull number crunching going on. And it's true, there was a lot of that. But very early on, people started to experiment with the non-numeric possibilities of stored programming. Here's one example that I'm particularly fond of. This is a screenshot of the monitor tube of the Manchester Mark I computer. The Manchester Mark I, which I'll say a bit more about later on, was the first stored program computer to run in Manchester, of course, in June 1948. And this is a screenshot of its monitor tube taken in probably in about mid-1952. It is, in fact, the first interactive computer game, and also, of course, a very early example of digital graphics. What are you exactly seeing on the screen? Well, here's the interpretation. The computer is playing drafts or checkers. And the program was written by this guy, one of my great heroes, Christopher Strachey. He's sitting sunbathing in the garden of his cottage in the south of England. I guess it must have been a really exceptional English summer to be able to sit outside without your clothes. He was one of the most brilliant of the first generation of computer programmers. He worked with Turing. It was Turing who initiated him really into computing. He got into writing programs for the Manchester machine via Turing's programming manual for the Manchester machine, which was the world's first programming manual. Turing gave Strachey a copy, he mugged it up, and within a couple of weeks he was writing brilliant programs for the Manchester machine. There's an extensive archive of Strachey's materials in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It's not particularly well catalogued, but there's a large amount of material there. And both this screenshot and the diagram, which is in Strachey's own hand, are from the collection of Strachey's papers in the Bodleian. Strachey produced another very striking example of non-numeric applications of stored programming. I just hope the technology works and we can do this. Even after all that setting up, which took us about an hour, it's not going to play it. Never mind. So Strachey composed some music. He made the Manchester computer play melodies. Turing was the first person to appreciate the possibilities of using a computer as a musical instrument. And Turing worked out how to make the Manchester computer play individual notes. He wasn't terribly interested in writing continuous melodies. He wanted to use his notes as sort of peepholes into the inner life of the machine. And, just as we do now, the machine would make kind of musical beeps in order to tell the user what was going on in the innards. Turing could see the potential of writing melodies, but it was actually Strachey who seized that potential, and he wrote some of the earliest computer-generated music. And I was going to play you one of the melodies that he composed for the computer. Maybe we can get it going. If there's enough time right at the end, we could do that, perhaps. On my machine? No, that will just take the slides backwards and forwards.
Perhaps
We'll do it later, yes. But anyway, fortunately my topic isn't computer music, so it doesn't really matter that the sound isn't working. I want to talk about the stored program concept itself. And the story starts with these two guys in 1935. So in 1935, Max Newman is a fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. He's a rising star in British mathematics. His specialisms are topology and mathematical logic. And Turing is a fidgety young graduate student. Turing is attending some lectures that Newman gave in the Foundations of Mathematics. And Newman describes what is one of the problems at the cutting edge of mathematical logic and the foundations of mathematics in those days, which we all know about, Hilbert's decision problem. And by Newman's own account, he says something in the lectures like, Well, the problem is whether it is possible to design a machine that could decide the first-order predicate calculus. And then, as Newman related in the 1970s, that inspired Turing to think about, well, what kind of machine could possibly be designed to decide the predicate calculus? And thence Turing invented what we now call the universal Turing machine, where, of course, you store the instructions on the Turing machine's tape. And the machine is able to step through the instructions one at a time. And in principle, the instructions are open to being edited by the same processes that execute them. So that the core idea of the stored program concept, the accessibility of the instructions to being edited by the same processes that are used to execute the instructions. So Newman related that Turing was immediately interested in building a machine of the type that he described. Turing could immediately see the potential, the practical potential of what he'd done. But neither he nor Newman at this time knew of any technology that was up to the job. They knew about relays, which were kind of the cutting-edge telecommunications technology of the time. Relays, rather large, rather slow, rather clunky digital switches with mechanical moving parts. They were used widely all around the world at that time in telephone exchanges, and et cetera, et cetera. Turing knew about these. He did a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation as to how big a universal Turing machine would be if he built it out of relays. And the answer that he came up with, probably a little bit exaggerated and a little bit jokey, but he said, this is going to be about the size of the Royal Albert Hall, which is, of course, an enormous building in the centre of London. Building a computer out of relays, according to Turing, was just not a practical proposition. He was wrong about that, actually. He got his calculations wrong, as we'll see later. But anyway, that was their belief at the time. Neither Turing nor Newman thought it was feasible to move ahead with building a universal Turing machine in the mid-1930s. And so the idea was sort of put on the back burner, and they got on with their lives. War broke out. They were both recruited to Bletchley Park to break German codes. And it was, in fact, at Bletchley Park that they first encountered the technology that they immediately saw could be used to build a universal Turing machine in hardware. And that technology was, as we all know now, electronics. It was Colossus that was the stepping stone from Turing's abstract ideas in 1936 to the stored program machines that were actually built in the post-war years. So Colossus was built by the great engineer Tom Flowers, one of the pioneers of digital electronics in the UK. It was built to attack Enigma's kind of sophisticated successor, a German crypto machine that the British codenamed Tunny. They were already breaking Enigma using machines, Turing's bombs, and so once they started intercepting Tunny messages in large quantities in 1941, 1942, it was kind of a logical step to build a machine to break Tunny as well. But because Tunny was so much more complicated than Enigma, they needed a much more complicated, much faster machine to break Tunny. The bombs were just relay technology, electromechanical technology. And so Flowers was called in and he said, yes, I can build the machine you want. Colossus. It was the world's first large-scale electronic computer. I've got a quotation here from Tom Flowers. Tom said, when after the war ended, I was told that the secret of Colossus was to be kept indefinitely, I was naturally disappointed. I was in no doubt, once it was a proven success, that Colossus was an historic breakthrough and that publication would have made my name in scientific and engineering circles. A conviction confirmed by the reception accorded to ENIAC, the US equivalent made public just after the war ended. I had to endure all the acclaim given to that enterprise without being able to disclose that I'd anticipated it. Flowers has never got the recognition that he deserved, and it's one of the saddest stories of the history of computing, I think, the way Flowers has kind of been edited out of the story, even though he played such a crucial role in those early years. I've got a photograph of the American machine that Flowers mentioned in that quotation, the ENIAC. Very famous machine, and of course, needs no introduction. It ran its first program at the end of 1945, a few months after the end of the war, at the Moore School of Electrical Engineering in the University of Pennsylvania. I'll have more to say about the ENIAC later. This is one of Colossus's programming panels, as they called it. They did speak of programming, even in that sort of the pre-era when electronic computing was just emerging. And in fact, going back before that era, they talked about programming. But the way Colossus was programmed bears very little relationship to what we understand now as programming. It was programmed via this panel by literally rewiring the machine. In order to set the machine up for a new job, you changed its wiring by throwing switches and plugging cables into different positions in this patch panel that you can see. It sounds unbearably primitive from today's perspective, but that is just because we are so immersed in stored programming. They simply didn't have it in those days. This was leading technology as far as they were concerned. It was the same for ENIAC. ENIAC also used the rewiring type of programming. And if things went badly, it could take the engineers as long as 2 weeks to reprogram ENIAC for a new task. Incredibly primitive. Just to give this programming paradigm a name, I call it P0, the zeroth programming paradigm. Although Flowers' work, Colossus, was unknown to the rest of the world because it was Colossus was kept secret until really the 1990s, and it wasn't until 2000 that there was a large declassification of materials that made Colossus kind of public knowledge. So in 1945, nobody knew about what Flowers had done. At first, nobody knew about ENIAC either, because ENIAC, like Colossus, was classified. But very soon, the Americans realized the importance of declassifying ENIAC and getting the word out. And so ENIAC was written up in the newspapers in 1946. And so ENIAC has gone down in the history of computing as the first large-scale electronic computer. But it wasn't so, it was Colossus. ENIAC first ran, as I said, two full years after Colossus first sprang into life. Colossus first operated in January 1944, and ENIAC, as I said, in December 1945. So although the rest of the world didn't know about Colossus, Turing and Newman did. As soon as they set eyes on Flowers' racks of electronic equipment during 1944, they realized immediately that this was the technology that they needed in order to build a universal Turing machine in hardware. And so after the war, Newman fairly quickly got himself a chair at the University of Manchester. He became the Fieldon Professor of Mathematics, and he very quickly established a computing machine laboratory with a view to building a universal Turing machine in hardware using the technology, the electronic technology that he'd learned from Colossus. Turing, on the other hand, got a job in London in the National Physical Laboratory, and his job specification was to design and oversee the building of an electronic computer. So kind of a race developed between Manchester and London. Newman in Manchester, Turing in London. It would have been historically entirely appropriate if Turing had won that race, because after all, the basic idea of the stored program computer was his. And he'd explained it to Newman, and Newman had been there at the beginning, but the ideas were Turing's. History seldom fair, of course, and it wasn't Turing who won the race, it was Manchester. Newman was joined by two engineers who'd spent the war years working on digital electronics, Tom Kilburn and Freddie Williams. And although they knew nothing of Colossus, and in fact knew very little about computing, they'd spent their war years working on radar, a completely different problem. But they'd pioneered pulse techniques for use in radar, and as a result, by the time they were hired to go to the University of Manchester in 1946, between them, they knew practically everything that there was to know about digital electronics. And so once Newman explained the idea of a digital computer to them, a universal Turing machine in hardware, they were fairly quickly able to develop the necessary hardware, the necessary technology in order to implement the idea. And here they are standing together in front of the world's first stored program electronic computer, the world's first universal Turing machine in hardware. That's Freddie Williams on the right and Tom Kilburn on the left. They called their machine Baby, appropriately enough, the Manchester Baby. And Baby is the distant ancestor of all our mainframes and laptops and tablets. It was kind of computer zero. It first ran a program in June 1948, as I mentioned earlier. As soon as Turing heard that Newman had got a Turing machine up and running in Manchester, Turing turned his back on his own project in London. He'd walked out of the National Physical Laboratory. He couldn't wait to get his hands on a universal Turing machine in hardware, went straight to Manchester and began pioneering computer science there, leaving his colleagues at the National Physical Laboratory working on the ACE to manage as best they could without him. They managed quite well, in fact. Things didn't move there as quickly as they did in Manchester, but they moved pretty quickly. And by 1950, the engineers had the pilot model of Turing's automatic computing engine, Turing's ACE, running programs. It's a very different machine in many ways from the machine that Kilburn and Williams built in Manchester. In particular, it had a different kind of memory. You can just see the memory off to the right of the picture there. Those two, what look like metal rods, slightly shiny metal rods right on the right-hand side, they're in fact part of the memory, or the support mechanism for the memory. They are two legs of a very strong table, a long, narrow table. And that table supports a wooden box. You can just see one end of it there, a sort of slightly paler rectangle. The engineers called that box the coffin, because that's what it resembled, a wooden coffin. And that was the computer's memory. It contained a number of mercury delay lines, they called them. These were metal tubes filled with mercury, and the pulses that were to be stored were routed to one end of the metal tube, where there was a piezo crystal which would change the electrical pulses into pulses of sound. And those pulses of sound, kind of pings, supersonic pings, would travel relatively slowly along the column of mercury. And then when they emerged at the other end, they'd be converted by a second piezo crystal into pulses again. The pulses would be cleaned up because there would have been distortion in the mercury column. They'd be cleaned up, amplified a bit, and then routed back to the beginning of the delay line again. And the pulses would just go round and round and round. They called it a recirculating memory. So that was one of the first kinds of computer memory. And it was the basis of many of the first generation machines. It sounds pretty weird now, the idea of storing binary digits in the form of pings of sound, but that's what they did. So what was Turing's view of the connection between the ACE and the Manchester machine and his universal Turing machine of just over a decade previously? Historians have had a lot of difficulty, as you will all know, kind of locating Turing's position in the history of computing. So a good place to start is, well, what was Turing's own view of the relationship between the new hardware and the concepts that he'd introduced in 1936? Well, here he is lecturing in London in 1947. He says, "Some years ago, I was researching on what might now be described as an investigation of the theoretical possibilities and limitations of digital computing machines. I considered a type of machine which had a central mechanism and an infinite memory, which was contained on an infinite tape." Digital computing machines are in fact practical versions of the universal machine. There is a certain central pool of electronic equipment and a large memory, and the appropriate instructions for the computing process involved are stored in the memory. So that's how Turing saw the connection between the earlier developments and the later. I think there's a perception nowadays that the idea that Turing was the originator of the stored program concept is kind of a modern idea, maybe a product of the Turing mania that broke out in 2012 as a result of the centenary year celebrations, which of course swept all around the world and turned Turing into a household name. But it just isn't so. The idea that Turing was contributed the fundamental idea, the stored program idea, is not a modern idea. And among Turing's colleagues in the National Physical Laboratory during the second half of the 1940s and the first half of the 1950s, it was well known that the fundamental idea originated from Turing himself. I've got a quotation here from Donald Davies, who in 1946, 1947 was a very young member of Turing's ACE group. He subsequently rose to direct the mathematics division at the National Physical Laboratory, but here he is in 1975 talking about Turing. He says Turing's 1936 paper on computable numbers contained the key idea on which every stored program machine was based. Of course, Turing didn't do it alone. Newman also played a role in developing universal Turing machines in hardware. Copeland did, Williams did, Davies himself did, and many others as well. So let me mention the names of some of my favorite heroes of the computing revolution. First of all, Charles Babbage, who I'm sure needs no introduction, the grandfather of computing. I'll say a little bit more about his mechanical computers in a bit. Presper Eckert, an unappreciated character, I think. Not quite so unappreciated as Flowers, but Eckert, too, has never really got sufficient credit for what he did, I think. He and the mathematician John Maudsley designed and oversaw the construction of the ENIAC. And I'll be talking more about Eckert later on. Next, John von Neumann, who again needs no introduction. Here's the computer that his engineers built at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies. It ran its first program in the summer of 1951, and the kind of official opening of the machine was in 1952. And this is one of the photographs taken during that official opening. It's a machine that never had a name. People call it the Princeton computer or the IAS machine. All the other early machines had slightly punchy names, the ENIAC and the BINAC and the UNIVAC and so on. The engineers, in fact, wanted to call this computer the MANIAC, but the authorities soon squashed that, and it's gone down in history as the computer with no name. My next hero, Dick Clippinger, again very little known. He worked at the Aberdeen Ballistics Laboratory where ENIAC was transferred at the end of 1946. I wish I had a better photograph of Clippinger, but it seems there just aren't any. And also Konrad Zuse, the great German pioneer of computing. This is Zuse standing with his Z4 computer in Zurich. His Z4 was the center of as some of you may know, the center of Europe's first computing laboratory. Z4 was situated at ETH in Zurich for about 5 years, and a computing center grew up around it, taking in work from industry and other universities and so on. It was the model for other computer centers that grew up around the world later. Zuse's machine was completely electromechanical. It was completely relay-based. There wasn't a single vacuum tube in it. What you can see Zuse holding there is cinefilm, celluloid film, 35mm film, and he used that as punch tape. He would punch the program instructions and the data into the celluloid film and run it into the machine through a special reader that he designed. So I want to talk about what all of those people contributed to the stored program revolution. But first I want to talk about some errors that have crept into the literature. And one is concerned with Charles Babbage's analytical engine. The analytical engine, of course, was never actually built. There's some hope that Doran Swade will rebuild the machine. Doran Swade rebuilt the difference engine, of course, at the Kensington Science Museum in London a few years ago, and he's now looking at rebuilding the analytical engine. But although there are many diagrams of the analytical engine, we don't, there is no artifact that we can look at in order to say, well, yes, that's how it would have been if Babbage had constructed it. But this is a model of a small part of it. It's a small part of the arithmetical unit, and it was constructed in the year of Babbage's death. There's a myth in the literature that Babbage had a version of the stored program concept and that the analytical engine was a stored program machine. It simply is not true. The analytical engine was programmed by means of punched cards, which were connected together with ribbons. It was essentially like Zuse's punched film arrangement. There were punched cards with data, programming instructions on them, connected together with ribbons, run them through the machine, and the instructions are read into the analytical engine. So if you wanted to run the same block of instructions repeatedly, then you had to run the cards repeatedly past the reader. I call this programming paradigm P1, just to give it a name. So in P1 you have punched tape, punched cards, punched film. You're basically using holes in some medium, and you run that medium through the machine, and the instructions are read into the machine and obeyed one by one. And if you want to run through a subroutine 100 times, then you somehow have to arrange for the set of punch holes that constitute the subroutine to be presented to the reader 100 times, again and again. You might do that if you're using punched cards, say, by simply punching 100 copies of the instructions and feeding that great block of cards into the machine. Or if you're working with tape, you might have a length of tape that's got that's got the subroutine on it, and turn it into a loop, and then run that loop through the machine 100 times. So P1 is obviously very different from the stored program paradigm. In some absolutely trivial sense, the program is stored in the tape or on the cards in the form of punch holes, but it's far from being the stored program paradigm that we're so familiar with today. Another myth is that Zuse's machine, in fact, incorporated the stored program concept. I've got a quote here from Nicholas Jeckier in 1969. Zuse's Z3 and Z4 computers were the first computers to have an internally stored program. They weren't. There is an interesting twist to the story, which I may have time to mention later. Zuse was aware of the stored program concept, but he never implemented it in his machines. His machines were P1 type machines, not stored program machines. Incidentally, this photograph of the Z4 gives the lie to Turing's back of the envelope calculation about the size of a machine that was capable of implementing the stored program concept but built out of relays. The Z4 is built out of relays. You can see it's quite a compact machine. How much more equipment would you have needed in order to implement the stored program concept by means of relays in the Z4? Don't know. You can argue about that. But even if it was twice as much or 4 times as much, you're still going to have quite a compact machine, a machine smaller than Colossus, in fact, and certainly a lot smaller than the Royal Albert Hall. So Turing was simply wrong. Now for some polemics. This man, Thomas Hay, is a very young but very influential historian of computing, currently at the University of Milwaukee. For the purposes of this talk, Tom Hay is kind of Satan. Tom Hay has made a number of statements in a whole array of articles that he's published lately about the stored program concept and the history of the stored program concept, all of which I disagree with, apart from one, as I'll explain. So Tom says, discussion of the stored program concept has outlived the purpose for which it was created and provides a shortcut to confusion. The term stored program, he says, rarely appeared in early documents. This fairly obscure term originated in an IBM internal memo in 1949, he says. Not true. Hay claims that the stored program concept is a historian's creation. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the idea of the stored program computer was borrowed from technical discourse, developing from a fairly obscure term into a central concept in heated debates over what should be considered the first true computer and why. This resurgence of the stored program concept as a concept for historical discussion was harmful, he says. He doesn't argue for that, he just asserts it, he just states it in a most unphilosophical way. I mean, the first thing you'd want to see are what are his reasons for these claims, but it's just polemics, he just asserts them. He is right that the term stored program rarely appeared in the early documents, and full marks for spotting that. But the reason isn't that the concept, the stored program concept, was absent from those early documents. It's that the founding fathers tended not to use the word program at all. Von Neumann used orders. Zuse also used orders and plan. He would talk about a calculating plan, where we would talk about a program. Turing stuck with his 1936 term instruction table, or just instructions. Here's Turing talking from that same lecture in 1947 in London that I quoted from earlier. He says, the machine will incorporate a large memory for the storage of both data and instructions. Sounds like the stored program concept to me, even though he's not using the term stored program. I've got a quotation here from the famous letter that Williams and Kilburn published in Nature announcing that the baby had first worked. They say, the program can be changed without any circuit changes. The essential parts of such a machine are, firstly, a store for information and orders. Williams and Kilburn's pioneering selection of the terms store and program turned out to be a way of speaking that many others would find natural too. And this is the earliest emergence in the literature that I've been able to find of something approximating to the modern term stored program. Okay, so now to my central philosophical question. What is the stored program concept? I claim that it's an onion skin, what I call an onion skin concept. It has a number of different layers or levels, and confusion is bound to result if the levels are not sufficiently distinguished. So the first level is S0, read-only stored instructions. S is the level at which the stored instructions are accessible to editing by the same processes used to execute the instructions. But S is just kind of potential. The instructions are potentially accessible to editing, but in S mode, no editing need actually occur, it's just that it could happen, there is the potential. If editing actually happens, then I call that the SE mode. The editing of stored instructions actually occurs, and it can occur in any of the following ways. SE with identity, where identity signifies no change of instruction. And that's what we find in Turing's 1936 paper. Turing edits instructions, but the instructions are edited by the addition and removal of marker symbols, but the instructions themselves aren't changed. If you're familiar with the 1936 paper, you'll know that Turing has a whole bunch of subroutines, and some of these go through the instructions on the tape and mark them up with various symbols, and then there are other subroutines for operating with marked up sections of instructions in various ways, and then finally another subroutine runs through the instructions and cleans them up, removes all the marker symbols, so that at the end of the computation, the instructions are exactly the same as they were at the beginning. All the marker symbols have disappeared. So that's instruction editing with no change of instructions. One step further in, SE delta I, where delta I signifies instruction change. The stored instructions themselves are changed. The symbols in the instructions are changed, and not just marker symbols. SE delta I itself divides into two types, which I call /self and /other. With /self, the program alters some of its own instructions as it runs, and with /other, the program doesn't necessarily alter its own instructions, but it does alter the instructions of some other program. In the early days, the pioneers thought that /self was really important. They seemed to think, from the way they wrote, that that lay at the heart of the modern computer paradigm. Nowadays, we don't think that. We regard /self as kind of rather bad taste, and we discourage our students from doing it. And nowadays, we know that the important member of those two, /self and /other, is /other, which led on to compilers and the whole of the computing world as we now know it. But in the early days, they tended to play down or even ignore /other and really highlight /self as the important part of the stored program concept. So what I want to do now, I mean, that's my conceptual analysis, just one slide. The rest of the talk is going to be history. I want to talk about the early history of the stored program concept. And as many of you will know, the history of the stored program concept is this terrible battlefield full of bitter priority disputes. But by using this onion skin analysis, it's possible to make a much more harmonious picture of the history emerge. Often people, when they disputed about who did what and they got there first and not so-and-so, they were talking past each other. They were talking about different onion skins. And as long as you distinguish the layers carefully, it turns out there's not as much dispute as would appear from reading the accounts by the pioneers and their supporters. But anyway, I hope to be able to produce a clearer picture of the early years of the emergence of the stored program concept. Let me first of all talk about S0, read-only instructions. This was implemented in ENIAC in 1948 using this part of ENIAC, which they called the function table. Function tables were basically resistance networks that were used for storing numerical constants. They were designed by Presper Eckert on the basis of ideas that Jan Reichman had suggested at RCA. And they were switch trolleys, basically. You could, using mechanical switches, you could switch data into the switch trolley. And so the machine would be able to read numerical constants out of the switch trolley. That's what they were designed for. Coefficients for equations in ballistics and so on, they were stored in the switch trolley. And then Dick Clippinger, who I mentioned earlier, realized that the switch trolleys could be used to store instructions and not just data. Clippinger says, I discovered a new way to program the ENIAC, which would make it a lot more convenient. I became aware of the fact that one could get a pulse out of the function table and put it on the program trays. This led me to invent a way of storing instructions in the function table. So, as you probably know, there's this dispute about whether it was von Neumann who discovered this way of programming the ENIAC. Haig, in his recent von Neumann boosting work, claims that it was von Neumann who was responsible for this concept. But Clippinger is pretty clear about it. He says, when Adele Goldstein noticed that I'd evolved a new way to program the ENIAC, she quickly passed the word along to von Neumann. And it seems that what von Neumann contributed, certainly not the concept itself, but was a more efficient way of coding up what was to be entered into the function table. Clippinger's scheme used a 3-address code, and what von Neumann contributed was replacing the 3-address code with a 1-address code, which enabled 2 instructions to be stored in each line of the function table. But it seems also that Clippinger reinvented the wheel. Eckert says, in Aberdeen, Dr. Clippinger later rediscovered these uses of the function tables. And Macaulay also says, people have subsequently claimed that the idea of such stored programs were quite novel to others who were at Aberdeen. So they pretty clearly had the idea before Clippinger reinvented it. But you can at least say that it was Clippinger who reduced the idea to practice. And now Eckert and Macaulay would describe the situation as they had the stored program idea before Clippinger, and certainly before von Neumann was aware of it. But if you distinguish the levels, then you can interpret them as saying that in the Moore School context, the idea of S0 was contributed by Eckert and Macaulay, and there's no reason to doubt that. What dispute can there be about that? But of course, S0 is not the whole of the stored program concept, it's just the first end of the spectrum. So let me summarize by means of a timeline what I've told you about so far. So in 1936, in On Computable Numbers, Turing describes both S, the basic stored program mode, where the instructions are available to editing, and he also describes SE with identity, SE with no instruction change, with his subroutines for inserting and deleting markers and so on. And then in 1948, ENIAC first implemented S0, probably in April 1948. The dates are slightly unsure. You get different dates in different accounts. Some people say April. Some people who were also there say November. But on balance, it seems likely that ENIAC implemented S0 in April 1948. And then in June 1948, the baby implemented S. And then there's the question of when instruction editing, S is just potential, and in the first months at Manchester, there was no use of instruction editing. They stored the instructions internally, but they didn't edit them. So there's the question of when was instruction editing first implemented. On my way of looking at it, that is one of the most important early dates of computer science. Yet you never see it noted. Sometimes you see it said that, well, it first happened in 1952 with von Neumann's machine at Princeton. But in fact, it's quite clear from the documentary record that it was in Manchester in 1949, April 1949, that an expanded version of the Williams-Kilburn baby was first implementing /self, using a special piece of hardware that they designed for that purpose, which they called the B-tube. It was in fact the first index register, and they were using that to edit programs in April 1949. So there's a glaring omission from this timeline. We've got S and SE identity described in 1936, and we've got /self implemented in 1949. But when was /self and /other first described? The answer is that happened in 1945. Both Turing and von Neumann described those concepts virtually simultaneously. These were in the two great documents of 1945 that kind of set out the modern stored programming paradigm. There was von Neumann's first draft of a report on the EDVAC, which Galtieri mentioned a couple of days ago, and then there was Turing's proposed electronic calculator. Neither were published at the time. They both existed in the form of typescripts that were circulated. Von Neumann's was circulated in the early summer of 1945. Turing's was completed by the end of 1945, so they were just a few months apart. So von Neumann described S and restricted /self. He allowed a program to modify its instructions as the program was running, but it was only the address bits of the instruction that could be modified. He blocked modification of any other bits of the instruction, whereas Turing allowed wholesale instruction editing. any part of the instruction could be edited by the program as it ran. And Turing also described, as well as describing unrestricted /self, he also described /other. And he is the first person that I haven't found anyone doing it earlier in the historical record. I think Turing was the first. Von Neumann did, but a year later. So it seems that Turing got first to unrestricted /self and /other. So what exactly did von Neumann contribute? I mean, as we all know, he's gone down in history as the originator of the stored program concept, which, as is implicit in my timeline, it isn't true. Eckert, of course, was in this very bitter dispute with von Neumann, claiming that it was he and not von Neumann who invented the stored program concept. Again, they were talking past each other. But Eckert said the stored program concept was my best computer idea. And he later wrote very sourly of von Neumann's way of taking credit for the work of others. Eckert was convinced that he had invented the stored program concept and that von Neumann had stolen his ideas. But Eckert hadn't invented the stored program concept, and if von Neumann did steal Eckert's ideas, it wasn't the stored program idea that he stole. Probably he didn't steal anything. He believed that, information should be shared, science should be public. The sequence of events is that von Neumann didn't visit the Moore School until the summer of 1944, whereas in January 1944, Eckert described S. This is in a memo that he wrote in January 1944. He described a kind of memory that I call the Eckert disk memory, and it's quite clear that he's describing S there. He's got instructions stored in the form of magnetic pulses around the edge of a disk, and those pulses are accessible to editing by the same processes that execute the instructions. But there is no actual editing. He's describing S with the potential for editing, but he himself says nothing about editing. He's certainly not describing S/E. There's no evidence that he ever considered S/E at this time. It's simply absent from what he wrote. Let's have a look at what other people say about von Neumann's contribution. Arthur Burks, who was one of von Neumann's closest collaborators, he worked on the ENIAC, and then he moved to Princeton with von Neumann and he was co-author of a bunch of pioneering papers produced at Princeton, co-authored with von Neumann and others. He said Eckert and Macaulay were saying that they would build a Mercury memory large enough to store the program for a problem as well as the arithmetic data. He said this in a letter before von Neumann first visited them at the Moore School. And he said that President John invented the circulating Mercury delay line store with enough capacity to store program information as well as data. Von Neumann created the first modern order code and worked out the logical design of an electronic computer to execute it. So Burks is saying fairly clearly that von Neumann made his contribution via designing an effective order code or instruction code, as in the case of Clippinger. Clippinger came up with the S0 concept, but von Neumann contributed an effective instruction format. And the same here in these quotes. Cuthbert Hurd, who worked closely with von Neumann at IBM, he said, "I never heard von Neumann make the claim that he invented stored programming." And Stanley Frankel, who was a friend and colleague of von Neumann's at Los Alamos, he said in a letter to the historian Brian Randall that von Neumann firmly emphasized to me, and to others I'm sure, that the fundamental conception is owing to Turing. And he continued, in my view, von Neumann's essential role was in making the world aware of these fundamental concepts introduced by Turing. So these are von Neumann's friends and colleagues speaking here. Yeah? Yes. Well, it's a good question. Right. That's a conversation killer. So these are von Neumann's friends speaking, people who were, very well aware of what von Neumann was doing and with the best possible disposition towards von Neumann. And this is what they're saying about von Neumann's role. So I think they have credibility. What Frankel says is interesting, but it's not the whole story, because after all, von Neumann did come up with restricted address modification before Turing. So that should not be left out of the account. Von Neumann came up with restricted S/E a few months before Turing did. Julian Bigelow, who was von Neumann's chief engineer at the IAS, he said, Turing's machine does not sound much like a modern computer today, but nevertheless it was. It was the germinal idea. And Bigelow described how when von Neumann wanted to initiate his engineers into the enterprise of building a computer, he gave them uncomputable numbers to read. So what did von Neumann himself say about it? Well, he said in a letter that he wrote to Norbert Wiener in 1946 that Turing's great positive contribution was to show that one definite mechanism can be universal. And then in a lecture that he gave at the University of Illinois in 1949, he said the importance of Turing's research lay in his demonstration in 1936 an appropriately designed machine can, when given suitable instructions, do anything that can be done by automata at all. So in those two quotations, von Neumann is sort of attributing to Turing the two fundamental pillars that support the whole edifice of modern computing, the idea of a universal machine and the idea of achieving universality by using instructions, editable instructions stored in the machine. There's a final twist to the story, which I hope I can get through in my remaining minute. To return to Konrad Zuse, the machines that Zuse actually built, the Z1, the Z2, the Z3, the Z4, none of those were stored program machines, as I said. But nevertheless, Zuse did arrive at aspects of the stored program concept at around the same time that Turing and von Neumann were making their contributions. In particular, in this document, this is a photograph of the first page of it, a manuscript, typescript that he produced in 1945. It's the sort of shadowy third member of the trilogy of great documents in 1945 that introduced the modern computing world. It stands alongside Turing's proposed electronic calculator and von Neumann's first report on the EDVAC. It's much less well known than the other two. It should be better known. There's a lot of rubbish, really, in the secondary literature about what Zuse did and what he didn't do. I got interested a few months ago in what the truth of the matter was, what did Zuse really think. And so with my friend and colleague Giovanni Sommaruga, we got hold of all the German materials that we could. Zuse's patent applications, Zuse's workbooks, diaries, notes, as well as this document and its predecessors. It went through a number of different recensions before it ended, manuscript recensions, before it ended up as this typescript. And we translated the lot into English, as far as I'm aware, for the first time, and tried to figure out exactly what the story was of Zuse's contributions to the stored program concept. And I've summarized what we discovered in this timeline. Well, not quite this one. This is the one you saw before, but with Eckert's contribution marked in green. In January 1944, Eckert describes S. And then here are Zuse's contributions. In 1936, in a patent application that he subsequently withdrew, the patent was never granted, Zuse described S0. And then in 1938, 2 years later, in manuscript notes in German shorthand, Zuse described S. He had stored instructions, accessible to editing. He didn't make use of editing at that time, but the basis was there, the potential was there. And then in the 1945 document that I just showed you a photograph of, Zuse described /other. He never talked much about, never implemented /self. Zuse could see that /other was the important one. He was quite right about that. And then just to end it, I've listed the sort of next clutch of stored program machines, just to put it in context. In 1945 was a great year for digital engineering, and a whole heap of machines started running stored programs on both sides of the Atlantic in that year, and also in Australia, the Australian CSIR Mark I, or CIRAC as it was later called. I'm sure I'm out of time.
Okay. Thanks and congratulations on your award. I agree with almost everything you say, except that the stored program idea or concept was already in the 1936 paper because, well, what I mean by that is I think that from a technological point of view and practical point of view, the most important aspect of the stored program concept is something you haven't really emphasized, which is this structural distinction between the input and output devices and the memory, whereby you can just insert the programs or the instructions into a memory separate from the input and output devices, and this gives you a lot of additional flexibility in how to modify the programs and so on and so forth. I need to keep it short. So, in that respect, of course, you would agree that if we define stored program that way, a Turing machine is not a stored program computer. But I think it's an important aspect of this history that should also be emphasized, without disagreeing with 99% of what you said. Thanks.
So you're saying that the universal Turing machine wasn't stored program because it didn't have input-output. Did I understand?
In one important respect, because it didn't have a separate memory from the input-output device.
That's true, but the kind of the logical separation was there between memory and input-output, and if you take the machine to be starting with a blank tape, as Turing, when we're not talking about the universal machine, but just an ordinary Turing machine, if it starts with a blank tape, then its first moves are to print out the input data that it needs on the tape. So the first n instructions in the table will be responsible for printing the input on the tape, and then the program takes over and computes with that input. So the logical distinction between inserting input and processing the input is there in Turing's paper. That it's all carried out by the same notional hardware, but the logical distinction that you want is there.
Yes, maybe it's a short follow-up.
I can hear you.
Okay. So let me ask. So in some sense, the way you describe the stored program, so it is already inherent in the notion of a universal Turing machine, of a universal machine. I mean, the way to build a universal machine already encompasses the notion of a stored program according to this conception.
No, I don't think so at all. You could perfectly well build a universal machine using what I've called P1, Zuse's punched film. You could build a universal machine that way. It would be very clumsy. Stored programming is undoubtedly the best way to implement the concept of universality, but it's not the only way.
a less philosophical question. Do we know whether this history is complete, whether either Zussi or somebody else worked for the Nazis on something like that, or there were Soviet programs? Do we have any idea about any of it?
Plenty of interesting Soviet stuff, but later. Did Sousa work for the Nazis? Yes, he did. He built a number of special purpose machines. He worked for Henschel during the war, and he was involved in the first drones, the manufacture of the first drones, aerially launched guided missiles. And he designed special purpose computers to improve the production process for kind of tweaking the wing angles and so on in the factory, but not using anything like stored programming. And they were very special purpose devices. They were certainly not universal machines.
Yeah, I'm an historical ignoramus, and I mean that. I know nothing about the history, as my wife will confirm, of really anything except for Norway and Norse mythology. I can handle that. So, Jack, this is really fascinating. I have no idea, about these controversies that you alluded to a few times, that there's a minefield here and so forth. But if I think about approaching this terrain with great trepidation, I would try to do it because of my own eccentricities, out of looking at the formal terrain, not the historical terrain, which would be presumably anathema to a bona fide historian of these matters. But if we just do that, and you humor me for a second, of course we know that the Turing machine is only one of, I don't know, I feel we could be comfortable in saying there are 10, at least, extremely nice equivalents, right? Some of which, unlike the Turing machine, have survived to this day as practically speaking useful. Like we still use them. Because now in computability theory, we really don't have students going about programming in Turing machines. So I just want to ask you, is there no antecedent in either those 10 or some other equivalent not in the 10? So in the 10, you would know them. I mean, these 10 would be things like register machines, right? And we could just keep going. So I find it incredible that it's not until 1936 that my formal interpretation of stored program computational thing doesn't occur. That just doesn't seem right. I mean, so I don't want to take any risks because I'm an ignoramus, but Frege, I'm just amazed. So can you, undoubtedly you've heard this probably even translated into a claim, but can you please address this in general, because I'm completely amazed.
Well, amazing or not, I think it just is the case.
Okay.
But in history, everything is conjecture because you never know what documents are going to turn up tomorrow. So you could challenge that conjecture by going back and finding some formal logical structure prior to 1935, 1936 that contained something recognizable as one of the layers of the onion skin. I've never encountered it. I mean, there was Gödel, of course, with representing the seeds of representing instructions by means of numbers, but representing logic formulae by means of Gödel numbers, proofs by means of numbers, and so on. So that's clearly an antecedent. But the actual stored program concept before 1935, I don't think so. I'd be fascinated if you could find anything.
Yeah, this is just a comment about programming. I think you left out William Tutt, whose programs, whose algorithms was the impetus for building the Colossus machine.
Well, I would have spoken for more than an hour on William Tutt if I thought I had time and anybody would be interested in listening. Tutt's certainly one of my greatest heroes. And he and Turing both worked as you probably know, both worked on Tunny. Turing, first of all, came up with a method called simply Turingery for breaking Tunny messages. Tutt had reverse engineered the Tunny machine. They had no idea. They intercepted messages that were distinctively different. As they came over the airwaves, they sounded like a strange new music, nothing like, that was the phrase they used, nothing like the Morse code of Enigma that they were familiar with. So they knew that there was some new encryption machine that the Germans were using. But they had no idea what it was like. With Enigma, they'd captured Enigma machines. The Poles had given the British a model of an Enigma machine just before the war. So they knew what the machine was like. But with Tunny, they knew there was a new machine. They had the encrypted versions of some of the messages that they intercepted. But how on earth to decrypt them? Tutt, amazingly, was able to reverse engineer the entire structure, the logical structure of the Tunny machine, on the basis of just 2 intercepted messages. It's one of the greatest feats of code breaking ever. So, yes, yes. Well, I don't think so. I mean, the bombs were already working by this time. The first bomb worked in May of 1940. So the bombs were certainly not stored program devices, but they were programmed. They were P0 machines. I mean, I'm not sure why you would say that Tutt was the first programmer. Of all the wonderful things that Tutt did, I don't think pioneering programming was one of them. He came up with the history was that Tutt reverse engineered the machine, but they didn't have a method for breaking the daily messages. They just knew what the machine was like. And you can know what the machine was like without having any idea how to break the daily traffic. That's where Turing made his enormous contribution to Tunny. He came up with the first systematic method for breaking Tunny messages as they were intercepted. And then Tutt improved on that. Turing's method was a hand method. You did it like solving crossword puzzles. Tutt wanted a much faster method that could be done by machine. And so he came up with the 1+2 break, as it was called, which was then implemented on Colossus. But Tutt didn't do any of the implementation. He just came up with an abstract method, which was later reduced to programming practice by others. So I don't see any point in that narrative where you can say Tutt invented programming.